I had one of our faithful members come to me after church last Sunday and ask me about a particular verse in the Bible. And to be honest with you, I had to say, gosh, I don't know. I'll do some research. So I did some research, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, that particular verse. Not just for the person that asked about it, but for all of you, really. You know, I know we've all read or heard a verse in the Bible that maybe we had a question about. Maybe we didn't understand it. Maybe we thought it was contrary to some things that we had taught as Christians. Or maybe it just didn't make common sense. And maybe it's because that verse, maybe you need a little help with those verses. And you're thinking, well, that can't be right. Well, we're going to look at some of those, especially one of them, the one that was asked about last week. Many times those verses are taken out of context. Or you just read half of a verse. You don't get the rest of it. Or you don't get the verses that are before it or after it. Oftentimes you need to read an entire chapter to understand what's going on when that verse was written, or when Jesus said those words, or when Paul wrote those words, to really understand what it's talking about. You know, Paul liked to use metaphors or similes that we talked about before. Sometimes that's a little confusing. Even Jesus used parables to tell stories that sometimes you think, well, did that really happen? Is that really what he meant? So, you know, there are quite a few misunderstood or misinterpreted verses and things in the Bible. But for instance, look at some of the Old Testament laws. A lot of those laws were given to the Israel nation to separate them from other people. You know, not cutting your side bangs and things like that, and wearing a little hat every time you go into the temple. Those were laws that were given to them to separate them from everyone else. So you would know when you saw them, that's one of God's chosen people. That person is Jewish. You know, and of course, most of the Mosaic law, Jesus replaced anyway with one law, the law of love. There are other ones. Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, plans for good and not for disaster. Some people read this, and I know there's one well-known television evangelist that uses this verse to say that your life will always be perfect and God's going to give you great success. And that's not what it says. Actually, this verse was written by Jeremiah. Jeremiah was writing this to the nation of Israel, who had been in captivity by the Babylons for 70 years. And he was telling the nation of Israel, please don't give up. Be patient. Wait, God has plans for you. That's what that verse says. It doesn't say that everything's going to be just fine and peachy and dandy for everyone. It's not what it says. Romans 8, one of the greatest chapters in the Bible. Verse 28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. That verse does not say that you will not suffer and you will not have loss. It says if you love him, he will work with you and work for you to get you over those things. It doesn't say you will not have to encounter suffering and loss in your life. He's not saying that. And here's a big one. Everybody knows this one. Matthew 7:1. Judge not, lest ye be judged. We as Christians should look at sin as if it's bad. Isn't that the same thing as judging sinners? But he goes on. You have to read the rest of that verse and a couple of verses after that. He tells you, you know, there you are judging someone that's got a speck in their eye when you've got a log in your eye. It's exactly what it says in Matthew 7. In other words, he's saying, don't judge someone if you're a hypocrite. If you're guilty of that sin, you shouldn't judge them. That's what he said. It's not saying never judge. That's not what it says. My oldest daughter was in a beauty pageant one time in Shreveport, and we went and they asked her a question about, when they asked her a question about somebody, and she says, well, I'm not one to judge. And I'm thinking, well, you must be guilty of the same sin then. We should, as Christians, confront sin. 1 Timothy 6:10 says, money is the root of all evil. That's not what it says. It says that, but it says a little more. It says, love of money is the root of various evils. The love of money is not the root of all evil, but the love of money is the root of some evils. That's what that verse says. And what about the one that says an eye for an eye? You put my eye out, I'm going to put yours out. You know what it says? That's what it's. You need to read all of the verses before and after what you're reading has that. And now Chris is going to read another one to us. This is from Matthew 23, verse 9. And this verse says something that we've all violated, I promise you.
Do not call anyone on earth Father, for you have one Father, and He is in heaven.
Okay, this simply says you can't call anybody on earth Father. Doesn't it? If that's all you read, right. That's what it says. Your boys can't call you Father. Well, look, Roy, same thing. The boys can't call you Father. Isn't that what it says? That's what it says. Go back and read the verses before it and the verses after it. This is Jesus talking to his disciples, one of his last long discourses that he gave to his disciples, telling them how to be and how to act after he's gone. He's not telling them that you cannot call your earthly father, Father. But if you stop right there with what Chris read, what's written on the front of your bulletin, that's what you would think. So I guess my kids got to start calling me Dad or Daddy or Pops or something like that, huh? And of course, my kids call me that anyway. They call me Daddy or Dad mostly, but you know, every once in a while, I guess when they need something, they say Father, which is okay. The next verse, right after what Chris read, says, don't call anybody teacher. Can't call anybody a teacher. And if you read those two verses, you think, okay, can't call anybody on earth Father, can't call anybody on earth teacher. What do I do? Read the verses before and the verses after, and Jesus explains to them what he's talking about. He says a lot in chapter 23 of Matthew. He says a lot about the Pharisees and the scribes. A lot of bad things about them, how they act, how they are. And what Jesus is saying in this verse is, don't call them Father just because of who they are. Don't call them Father because they tell you you have to call them Father. Don't call them Father simply because they're a religious person. That's what Jesus is telling to them. These Pharisees and these scribes, they wanted to be called Father. They wanted to be called teacher. Because they thought they were the supreme religious authority. They thought they were. You know, pompous, like this, that kind of person. That's who they thought they were. And Jesus is telling his disciples, and Matthew in writing this is telling us, you don't call people like that Father for religious purposes. They're not the supreme Father. There's only one of those, and that is your God in heaven. That's exactly what Jesus is saying here. Anybody that wants to elevate themselves to a position of supreme spiritual authority does not deserve the name and the title of Father or teacher, for that matter. Neither one. It has nothing to do with your earthly parent that we can call Father. It simply means don't take on a title that you do not deserve and that you bring upon yourself, the title you create for yourself, because the supreme leader of religion is our Father God in heaven. Those Pharisees and scribes, they wanted to be called Father. They wanted to be called Rabbi. You know, Rabbi means teacher. And they wanted to be called that because they thought they were it when it comes to religion during the times of Jesus. But Jesus is telling us that we shouldn't call them that simply because they think they're that much better than us. We call God by many names, but the number one name that is reserved for him as far as spirituality and religion is concerned is the name of Father. Now this is different from, you've heard Abba, Father, A-B-B-A, not the group from overseas, but the name Abba, Father. Abba signifies more of a daddy name. Abba, Father is like saying my daddy, Father. You know, it is more of shows a more personal relationship with God than a revered relationship like just the word Father. Abba, Father is more like, all right, that's my God, that's my guy, you know. Whereas Father is like, that's Lord, that's the Lord. And that's so Abba Father is sure you remember the song, Abba Father, send your spirit, glory Jesus Christ. It's a beautiful song. You can play it during like an offering or something if you can find it. It's hard to find, but it's called Abba Father. There are 2 or 3 of them, but this one is Abba Father, send your spirit, glory Jesus Christ. It's a really good song. Now, what about Catholic and Episcopalian preachers? They're called Father. It's a title that they have earned simply because of their position on earth. It's not a title of reverence for them. They're called Father and sometimes called Rabbi because, and it's out of respect for their parishioners, the members of their church. It's not because they are a supreme religious figure on earth. We aren't putting their authority above God's by calling them Father. And I've heard some people call them Rabbi when, I don't know, they don't want to call them Father, I guess. They just call them Rabbi. But the scribes and the Pharisees, they were the ones that Jesus talked a lot about in chapter 23. Actually, more than that. He did several times about how they were religious hypocrites. They would almost do anything for attention, which is what they were. They're the ones that were chasing Jesus down all the time, trying to put him down, trying to prove him wrong, trying to make him look bad by doing something on Sunday or the Sabbath that they think he shouldn't have done. This is those people that we're talking about here. They thought they were the religious authority, not Jesus, and especially not God in heaven. You may be able to think of some modern TV evangelists or people that are that way, huh? They think, well, I'm it, you know, I'm the preacher. I'm the one you need to listen to and do what I say. People like to call themselves names simply out of wanting to be more than they really are. That reminds me of a friend of mine when we were young. He had mental problems, and his family took him to the hospital down in Pineville, the state hospital, which is a mental hospital. And he was there a couple of days, and he was sitting in the cafeteria, and someone asked him and says, "So who are you?" And he says, "Well, I'm Jesus." And they said, "Well, what makes you think that?" And he said, "Well, God told me I'm Jesus." And some guy across the room says, "No, I did not." So Jesus was telling his disciples to be different. Don't strive for personal glory or public recognition. Humble yourself before God, as we're told in Luke 14:9. He told them that the greatest in his kingdom are the meek and the modest servants in Matthew 20:26. He told them that genuine kingdom seekers don't demand recognition, but instead desire God be glorified in Matthew 5:16. And none of these really describe the Pharisees of his day. They didn't do those things. But you can also find the use of the word Father throughout the Bible in other places. What about the 5th commandment? Honor thy father and thy mother. Right there it says, yeah, it's certainly okay to call your earthly, biological father by the name Father. The Apostle Paul in Corinthians called himself the spiritual father of the nation, of the city of Corinth, the church in Corinth. He called himself that. And the term father is often used to refer to some of the ancestors of the Jewish people at that time. What about Father Abraham? He's still to this day called that. And Jesus referred to the devil as the father of lies. So, it can be used for other things also. But when you're talking about the supreme authority on religious matters and your lives and your Christianity, you're talking about God. The name Father, which should always be capitalized, is referring to him. No one on earth should be pretentious enough to take that title for themselves because they think they are the supreme authority when it comes to religious matters, like those Pharisees did. They exalted themselves above Jesus, and then one day they were humbled. But the disciples of Jesus humble themselves before God and Jesus, and one day we will be exalted. So, in the original Greek, in Matthew 23, Jesus starts what he's saying here by stating, "Neither be ye called." In other words, he's saying, don't have the desire to be called Father because you think you're a religious leader. He started, "Neither be ye called." Now, as I told you, I have several children. More than you, Tony. They call me Father and Daddy. But in my religious position here in this church, don't call me Father. I'm not worthy to be called that. I prefer what Billy Ruth likes to call me, the preacher teacher. You should call your Father in heaven Father. And you should call him often. Amen.
Amen.